Byte Tips.
Welcome to another Tech Byte Tips video. In today's video, I'm going to be redoing or readdressing an issue that was requested and I addressed about 10 months ago. And that's about this Gluetun application that was requested, which basically allows you to have other Docker containers or systems in your network to pass their traffic through Gluetun, which is then passing that through a VPN. And in the previous video, I was addressing whether we could do that in a Synology NAS, because at the time, I was using Synology 7.1 and it did not have the new container manager system that allows us to do a lot of nice things in Docker. So I was able to get this container running, but I pointed out that the container then kind of has issues if your NAS has to restart or something like that, because then, you know, it wouldn't fit with how Synology designed their user interface to work, so it would stop the container from working properly, and then you have to go into the terminal and get it to work again. But now we have DSM 7.2, and with that we have Container Manager, which allows us to build our Docker loads in a more complex way and allows us to do a lot of other things. So I'm going to cover how to get Gluetun working properly now with DSM 7.2 and just testing it and showing you how to get an application like QbitTorrent behind Gluetun, so that then you don't have to use a VPN built into the QbitTorrent image. So let's get to that. First thing is we go into the Gluetun GitHub page, that if you remember, that's located in QDM12 Gluetun. Then we have information here from the creator of Gluetun that shows us how to set stuff up. And in this example, we get here a nice Docker Compose file, and that's what we're going to be using in this case. We're going to go ahead and go into our NAS and create a project and the folders that will make this doable. So let's just copy this first. We have all that Docker Compose, and then I'm going to go into my NAS, and in my NAS again, I'm going to open the file station, and in here I'm going to go into Docker, and then for projects I'm going to create one that is going to be named Gluetun, and let's say QbitTorrent. So that's going to be our project, and then we need to go into the configs, and then here we have the QbitTorrent VPN, and we don't have QbitTorrent only, so we need to create a folder for that, and we also need to create a folder for Gluetun that we don't have. I'm going to go here, Gluetun, I have one for that, and then QbitTorrent. There we go. Now we have for QbitTorrent with nothing and Gluetun with nothing. So this is where our configuration files are going to be, and here in the project is where our Docker Compose file is going to exist. So now let's go here into the projects and let's create a new one that is going to be Gluetun QbitTorrent. Perfect. So I'm going to say that I'm going to put this into the projects Gluetun and QbitTorrent, and I'm going to create a Docker Compose file, and I'm going to paste that which I copied from the GitHub repository, and then we need to start making changes to this. We're going to be covering those changes now. So the first thing here is that we see that it says that we're going to create a service named Gluetun, and we're going to be using the Docker Hub image of Gluetun. That's perfect. I want to name this container as Gluetun, so I uncomment that and put the name there, and in here it tells you that there's a URL for you to figure out how to connect external containers. So if we go into this URL, it's going to tell us that whenever we want another container to pass its network through the Gluetun network, we need to put this line here that says network mode service Gluetun. So that lets us know that that other container is going to rely on Gluetun for the connectivity. And it says that we don't really need the depends on, but you could put the depends on for that. And it says that's if the container is in the same Docker Compose file. But if you have another container that is not in the same Docker Compose file, then you would put it this way, which is basically the same network mode. But in this case, it's just saying the network is going to be with the container named Gluetun. And then if you're doing that with a container that is in another Docker Compose file, it's basically putting this thing here that says network mode, but instead of just putting service Gluetun, we need to reference not a service but the container. So then the change will be container Gluetun. So that's letting us know how we connect another container to the Gluetun container that we're going to be spinning up. Alright, the next thing that we need to make sure is that we have the capability added to manage the network. So that's why we are giving this container the network administrator privileges. That means that it can create a tunnel device if it needs in our network. So it's basically like giving it almost high privileges, but on the network side only. And in here, we're specifying the device, the tunnel device that is going to be used. And in this case, we're just going to put the devnet ton. That's usually what is needed for this. Now, the next thing that we see here, where it says ports, this is which ports we want to expose for this container. So remember that for ports, every time we do this, we're talking about the outside and then inside the container. So in here, it by default shows us HTTP proxy shadow socks, but we're going to change this later to specify which ports we want to expose on this container. Remember that this container really doesn't have a user interface or anything, so we're just exposing things that we need to have traffic flow properly. Alright, the next thing here in the volumes, we would have to specify the path to our config location. So we can go back here into the Docker configs and we look for Gluetun and we say properties and we grab this. And this is going to be the path that we're going to specify here for the configuration file of Gluetun. And now here's the crucial, most important part here, which is going to this URL here, because this part that says environment is the environment variables that are going to set up how our system in Gluetun is going to work, how it's going to behave. So we need to specify information here regarding our VPN provider. The good thing about Gluetun is that it allows you to work with a bunch of different providers and it makes it really simple for you to use. So you need to go into this website and figure out what you're going to do here for the configurations, because you have several options. You have OpenVPN as a way to connect. You also have WireGuard. So you need to identify which way you want to do this. We're going to cover this in a second. Let's just open this URL for now. And once you open that URL, you find this GitHub page that has a bunch of stuff in here, which is very good. He explains very clearly what you need for each provider. So it tells you that there's some links here on how to configure several things for the application, but the main thing that you want is go to the providers directory and pick your VPN provider to get started. So providers directory is all the way up here, and if you click here, then you have a full list of VPN providers. You would go into this list and look for the one that you have and check if it's supported or not. Let's say, for example, in my case, I would be using private internet access because that's the one I have. So I would click here and they have a full readme here on how you configure Gluetun to connect to private internet access. And it tells you, for example, you can run it directly on Docker here if you want. And then that's all the stuff that you have to provide. But if you're using a Docker Compose file, which is the case of us, then we would go with this version here. So if you see, it tells you all the things that we already have configured, like the image, netadmin, and the configuration directory. But then here's the important part, which is how we configure the VPN provider. So in this case, it says that I would have to put private internet access as the name of my VPN service provider. So let's go back here. And I'm going to put here where it says VPN service provider, I would put exactly that. I go back here and it says you have to put the username for your OpenVPN connection to the provider. So this means that it's your username and then your VPN passwords. You have to put those two here. So it would be like going in here where it says OpenVPN user, you put your user and then you put your password here. And those are your credentials for the VPN provider. And then we go back into the documentation. It basically says that we have to specify the region that we want to connect to. So to get the region, you have to check the definitions of your VPN provider. Now, where do I find the server region that applies to my VPN provider? Because it's not shown in here, right? So actually it's very easy to do. But first, before I go there, let me continue with this information about the required variables and the optional variables, right? So if we see here, the only thing that are required for my provider here is the name, which I already have, the user and the password, which are here, right? This part here that says server regions is not even necessary. But what happens, right? If I do not specify a region, then it's just gonna connect to any random region that it wants. So it could be connecting to a region that is relatively close to me or on the other side of the world. So if you specify the server regions, then you're letting it know, okay, whenever you start up this container, here's the list of places where I want you to connect the VPN to. And it can be just one. For example, here they have Netherlands, or it could be a list separated by comma of different regions. So it could be, for example, Netherlands, comma, and then another region. And that's an optional parameter. We can even go deeper into that. So if we want a specific server name that we want to connect to, let's say, for example, we're trying to connect to New York, and let's say that private internet access has 5 different servers in New York. I could go as deep as saying I want to connect specifically to server number 1 or server number 3. You have that ability. You can even go as far down as the host name too. So they have a list of host names that represent servers for the provider, and you can use that too to define where you want to connect. And remember, all of these variables are a list, or they could also be a list. It could be one item or a list of comma separated items. Additionally, for my provider here, it has other things. For example, they have the port forward only option. So that means that if you enable this, it'll connect to servers that have the port forwarding available. Here we have the other variable that says private internet access OpenVPN encryption preset. So in here by default is going to use strong encryption. But if you want to change that, you have the ability to specify this flag here, this environment variable, and then saying you want it strong, you want it normal, you want it not to be encrypted, right? So if you say none, nothing is encrypted. I would discourage you from ever using that. And ideally you would go with strong. Another thing that it has is the OpenVPN endpoint port, so you can specify a different port if that's the case, if you have that available. Additionally, for some providers you have the VPN port forwarding. By default it's turned off. But if you need to do port forwarding through your VPN and it allows you to do that, then you can set this flag to on in this environment variable, and then it'll enable port forwarding on the VPN server. We also have the VPN port forwarding status file, which is a file path to write the forwarded port number to, and that stays in the Gluetun configuration as a file. But those are honestly seldom used. The main thing I would say that you have to pay attention to is the region name or host name. And now I'm going to go into the repository to show you how you do that. They also have a WireGuard VPN type, but this is really still not stable, and not all VPN providers support this. So for now I would say if you want it stable, ignore WireGuard and go for OpenVPN. But once it gets worked on and it becomes better, then they'll probably have more information here for you to use it. So now, how do we figure out which server regions we have, or server names or host names? Easy. We go back into the repository where we were. Instead of going inside the providers folder, they have a nice little file here called servers. You click here and it tells you about how the list is created and all that. And then they have an option here where you could see a list of all of the servers. So you see the built-in Gluetun server list. So we can click here and it'll give us a raw dump of all the lists that are in the repository for the servers for all the different VPN providers. So let's say, for example, I need to find my VPN provider. So I would do a search here for private internet access, for example, which is the one I use. And then I'll get a list here of all the different servers for my provider. So I can easily look for a region here. And then we get the name of the region that we can specify. We have a server name. Like they said, you can specify a server name or a host name. So you can use these values to build your list of the places that you want your Gluetun to connect to. And as you can see here, if I specify, for example, that I want the Australia Adelaide region, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 servers available in that region. So you have 7 servers for that. You know exactly where you're connecting to, and you can create a list of things here for you. So let's say I'm going to go down in this provider, but I want to look something more close to me. So let's see if I can find As you can see, that's a lot. So you have to, carefully search in here and make sure that you're still on your provider, because remember, this is a full list of everything. Now within the US, we have a bunch of different regions where they have servers. For example, we have Alabama, we have Alaska, we have Arkansas, Atlanta, Georgia. You have a bunch of options here. So you can pick several regions if that's what you want. For example, Baltimore is pretty close to where I'm at, so I could choose Baltimore, and they have different server names for Baltimore. They have two, so you could use that. So you build your own list based on this file and make your list, or just pick one if you only want one, you want to always connect to one, and you put that here in the configuration. So in my case, let's say I'm going to pick Baltimore, so I'm going to say region is US Baltimore. Let's go back into our file here. I don't have the option here, so I have to add that option. So let's make sure that we do that. Here we go. Server regions, US Baltimore. Like I said, if you want another one, you can say US Alaska, for example, and you would have your list of 2 cases where you can connect when the container starts up. I'm going to just leave it at US Baltimore. For now, that's fine for me. And like I said, I'm not going to use WireGuard, so I'm going to get rid of this. And then here in the time zone, this where you specify the time zone for your container. So in my case, it would be America, New York. And here's another important thing that we have, that if you wanted to update the list of the provider that you're using, you can create this environment variable here, and then it'll update the list automatically every once in a while. So let's go into that file and see what that does. When we click here, it says update periodically, and then it says by default this is disabled, but you can set it up to update the information on the servers that you're currently using for your provider. So you can say updater period, and then you specify a time, for example 24 hours. So if I do this, then it's going to check every day to see if the list of servers, because remember that in here we have a list of IPs, right? So those IPs could change. When we set this up, then it's going to check for this specific region that I have selected, has there been any change in the IPs that I can connect to, and then it'll update that. So that's really good if you notice that your VPN provider kind of changes those IPs constantly. You can put that in there, and then you're going to make sure that that's going to update that. So for now, let's save this, but I'm not going to trigger it, so let's not mark this. Now we should have here the Gluetun. So if I click here and I go into the YAML configuration, now we can continue making changes here. Remember, we were not only going to be putting Gluetun here, I said that I wanted to deploy QbitTorrent with this project. So we need to add that too. So how do we do that? Let me add a little bit of code here, and then I'm going to go slowly into explaining all the changes. All right, apologies for taking so much time in covering this section here, but this is crucial, so that's why I'm taking my time explaining you how you find the information that you need to put in here. Right now, this would be the final form of the YAML configuration for this deployment that is going to have 2 containers. Remember, this is YAML, so always make sure that you follow the separation for things, or it's going to complain and not work. So you see that we're defining services, and there's 2 containers that are going to be services here. One of them is Gluetun, and the other one is going to be QbitTorrent. Now for the Gluetun one, I have specified that I'm going to be using the Docker Hub image, the latest tag. We're going to name this container Gluetun. We need to have it with a name if we're going to have other containers connecting to it. So always make sure to have this. We're giving it permission to manage the network, and we're saying that use the devnet-ton as the interface for the VPN. And then in here in the ports, this is a section that is important. I skipped before because I needed to have QbitTorrent here for you to understand what's going on. Remember, the first is the outside, exposed on the IP of the NAS, and the right is inside the container. So here, the first thing that we're exposing here is the QbitTorrent user interface. Why? Because now QbitTorrent is going to be running inside the network of Gluetun. So if we need to expose QbitTorrent, we need to do it through Gluetun. So we're putting that on the port 8080 of our NAS. It's going to hit port 8080 of the Gluetun network, which is actually connected to the QbitTorrent container. So if we go here, we see that the web UI port is 8080. So that's going to allow us to access the user interface of QbitTorrent. Now, remember that QbitTorrent is transferring things using TCP and UDP. So that's why we also expose port 6880 inside and outside the container on both TCP and UDP, so that the communication in the torrenting network is successful and we're able to transfer and receive files. And that makes sure that we have QbitTorrent working through Gluetun. Now, the next thing was, as I said, the location of the Gluetun configuration that we have specified here, and it's going to be /Gluetun in the container. And then here the environment variables, where we specify the name of our provider, what type of connection we want to establish, which is OpenVPN, as is the most reliable one right now. And then we specify the user and the password to connect to the VPN provider. We specify the region that we want to connect to. And we also specify that the time zone of the container is going to be, in my case, America, New York. And we say, okay, every day make sure that the list of IPs that we have for the US Baltimore region is updated and we have the right ones. And I say, in the end, make sure that this container is always started. So even like if it's for some reason stopped, it will restart it again. So that's all for Gluetun. Now Gluetun is ready to connect to the VPN and expose our QbitTorrent application. Now we need to add in the same YAML configuration for this Docker compose file that we want to also deploy QbitTorrent when we run this. So we're adding a second service, so you can see it's in line with the Gluetun service. And this is using the Linux server QbitTorrent image in Docker Hub, specifically the latest version. And we're going to name this container QbitTorrent. And in here, we say that we want it to connect to the Gluetun network. So that would be the service that we defined up here that is named Gluetun in lowercase. So that's why it says service Gluetun lowercase. Remember, services Gluetun. So now we're telling it, okay, all my connection is going to go through Gluetun. And then in here, we specify the typical environment variables that we need for our QbitTorrent to work properly. So we give it the user ID 1026, which is the first user account that you create when you set up your Synology NAS, which is usually the administrator, and the group for that account, which is usually always 100. And I also say to QbitTorrent, make sure that your time zone is America, New York, so all the logs make sense to me. And we're going to be using the port 8080 for our user interface. And then in here, as before, I'm specifying that the config folder where I'm going to store the configuration for QbitTorrent in my NAS is going to be the path here in my NAS. And the folder that contains all my media, that means the downloads that are in progress and all the stuff that has already been processed, is mounted into the HTPC directory, which is here in my NAS. And this is important, this is crucial. We're saying that this container depends on another container. So this is dependent on the Gluetun service. So we need to have Gluetun healthy, so Gluetun is already connected and working before we can start this QbitTorrent container. So this is important. We're telling it will not work unless Gluetun is working properly. And then again, if for some reason the service is stopped, we want this container to immediately get started again. So we have everything that we need here. So now we should be able to save this. Let me just save it for now because I have my QbitTorrent VPN using port 8080. So that's going to give me problems if I try to run this. So let me fix that real quickly. All right, I've made sure to change the other QbitTorrent container to use another port so it doesn't give me problems here. And now we should be able to start this project and see how it works. Since these credentials are not valid, I'll probably get some kind of error letting me know that it couldn't connect, but that's important. I want to show that too. So let's now build this project because I have not built it. So let's do build. It's going to pull those images. So it's going to pull QbitTorrent and Gluetun, and then it's going to create the network for Gluetun, and it's going to set up Gluetun, make sure that everything is working. And once Gluetun is working, then it's going to spin up the QbitTorrent container and it's going to add it to the Gluetun network. So we should get everything through our Gluetun network. This is going to take some time, so I'm just going to pause and come back when that is done. All right, and this is what I wanted to show you. The container Gluetun started, but since I didn't have the proper credentials, instead of properly continuing, it said, the service is unhealthy for Gluetun, and then it exited. So let's see quickly what happened here in the containers. As you can see, the QbitTorrent container wasn't even tried to be started because this never got to a healthy state. So that's why this is important. It's crucial that we have QbitTorrent depending on Gluetun. So let me go into Gluetun real quickly. And in here we'll see that, I don't have proper credentials. So let's look at the logs and see what it says. So the logs are from the latest to the oldest. So let's go down a little bit and see what happened here. So you can see that this, it showed us, made with love by Gluetun. And then it started preparing the Gluetun container. It set up the gateway, the local IP for the Docker containers and all of that. It looked for the server details and everything. And then it says, the VPN settings are there. And it says I'm using private internet access. I'm using OpenVPN. I'm going to connect to the Baltimore region using UDP. And I'm using the strong encryption. Remember, I left that as a default, so it's going to default to strong. And then it says I'm going to be using OpenVPN 2.6. And there's a username and a password here that it's not showing, obviously, because those are sensitive details. But it says that it was set, so we do have those provided. And again, it says that it's going to use the tunnel 0 and the containers running as root, obviously because we need high privileges for the network management and stuff like that. And then the verbosity level is at 1. And then it says the DNS server address is going to be localhost. And check for the changes in the IPs every day as I configured it. And it has a bunch of other stuff here. Then it goes basically into the configuration of the network. So it's using a 10.0.0 for this. And it says the firewall is enabled, and it says that how long it took to read the headers and the read timeout and all of that. And then it says that it's listening on a port 8000. Let's go ahead to more important details here. So here we go. It says it found a default route for the interface Ethernet 0, and it assigned a local IP using IPv4 and deciding a route for everything. And it says the server's listening on port 8000, and now it's connecting to the VPN. And it says it's preserving the recently used address. In this case, it picked this IP address for that. And then it says that it started connecting to the Baltimore 402 server, which is the one we selected. And that's the IP that it's trying to connect to. And then it says that it received a message that says you're not authorized. And why you're not authorized? Because the credentials are wrong. So it says your credentials might be wrong. So that's exactly what is wrong here. And it gives us information on things that we can use to troubleshoot this. And then again, it seemed to have tried again with another one of the IPs, and it said my credentials are wrong, and it kept on trying. It looks like, basing on the IPs, actually was the same IP that it was connecting to. So it performed several attempts to try to connect. But every time it tried to connect, unfortunately, it couldn't connect because the credentials were wrong. And once it hit that threshold of attempts, then it just exited. So that's what happens when you provide wrong credentials. So now let me go back into my container and fix that, and then see what happens when I run this with the proper credentials. And here is the expected result when we provide proper credentials. As you can see, it says that Gluetun was started and it found that it was healthy. So that means it was able to connect to the VPN, and then it started the QbitTorrent container. So now let's quickly take a look at the logs to see what the difference is. So everything in here seems pretty similar to the other thing. We have our username and password set, but we can't see them, and everything is correct in here. Now let's go to where it actually tries to connect and see what happened. So here it says that the HTTP server is listening, and then it says it starts the connection to the VPN, and then it says it selects the last used IP, so that was this one, and then it initiates the connection to the VPN at that Baltimore server that we specified, and it says that it opened successfully the device ton 0. Remember that we specified a device, and it says that it's up and working, so that's perfect. And then it assigned it an IP address in the 10 range, so we have a 24/24, so that's 256 IP addresses for this network. And it says that the OpenVPN was configured to add an IPv6 route, but IPv6 is not configured, so it was not assigned. In my case, that makes sense because I have disabled IPv6, but if you have IPv6 enabled, it might have been able to use IPv6. Now in here, it set the user ID to a non-root user now to the container, so now the container runs the VPN as non-root. That's really good. And then it says that now it updated the host names and IP blocks like we said every day, so this is when it does that. And then it says that the health check was healthy and everything is working now, and it says that our public IP address with that server that we specified is this one, and then it says that we're running the container without any problems. So this is looking good. Now let's check if our QbitTorrent is actually working. So here's the logs for the QbitTorrent, and it's pretty straight up. It says it's brought to us by Linux server, and it's using the proper user ID and group ID that we gave it. And it basically started immediately the web user interface on port 8080. And it says that a temporary password was provided for this session because this is a new container that we have not configured. So we need to make a note of this password for now. So let me just write it down. HQ capital D, lowercase r, L, G, A7J. All right, so this is the password. And it says that you should set your own password in program preferences, and then it says that everything is working and everything should be up. So we can validate that by going into the IP of our NAS on port 8080, and look at that. It immediately came up for us and is asking for a username and password. So in here we would have to put that password that we just copied. And I believe the username should be admin. I'm not sure. Let's try. And here we go. It was admin and that password that we were given. So if this is your first time running QbitTorrent, then you would see this. You would see that you have to set it up. It's not set up. So if we go here, we'll see that like all of the configuration is just not right. So in my case, I was lucky enough to have already created QbitTorrent and configured it. So what I can do is I can just stop this container and then copy the configuration files from the previous one into this one, and then it should start this one up as if it was the other one with all the configurations that I set for it. So let's do that. First, let me go into the NAS and stop QbitTorrent and wait for it to actually turn off. So now you see it says stopped, and then I'm gonna go here into the Docker configs. What I'm gonna do is first I'm gonna check what I have here in QbitTorrent, and I have the QbitTorrent folder, and in here is where we have the configuration stuff, so that it's looking perfect. So I can just go back here into the configs and grab the QbitTorrent VPN one and grab the files that I have here, and there's a difference here. So we have the cache config and data. In the config, we have the qubit data and qubitconf and watched folders. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of this, and I'm going to look for those files in the other configuration folder. So data, torrent, and watched folders. Let's go back in here and look for QbitTorrent and see if we can find that. So we don't have a config folder, but we do have the data, conf, and watch. So I can just paste this and overwrite the files, and now it should have the configurations of my previous QbitTorrent configuration, so it should behave just like that one. So I can go back again into the container and start it. All right, it is complaining that I need to join a network, so I guess the best way to do this is I'm gonna have to restart the project again. So let's go back into the project, and then let's say we want to restart this, and then it's going to recreate the containers, and then it should behave okay, because remember that we are storing those configuration files in the NAS, so it should be able to read those configurations, and even though it's a new container, the container should behave like the old one that we had. Alright, so I got an exit code 0 message, and it said that it restarted both containers, so everything is looking appropriate here. Now we can go back into the IP of the NAS on the port 8080, and now the QbitTorrent user interface is reloaded again, and now we should be able to use the QbitTorrent as the username and the password, because I believe that's what I set up on my previous one. So let's click login, and there we go. it logged in with the credentials of my previously working QbitTorrent container. And now if I check on the configurations of it, we should see that all the configurations match what I specified. So we have here, for example, for the downloads, we have the proper directories that I specified. That lets me know that it read that properly. If we go into the connection, all the configuration details that I put are making sense here. On the speed, the same. On BitTorrent, all the configurations that I had here, including the tracker that I want to add to my torrent, is there. For the web user interface, again, everything is the same, the username and password that I specified, etc. So it properly read the file that I had, and everything should be working properly. So now we can test that we are connecting using the VPN to our torrents. So let's find some torrent here for a Linux ISO or something similar, and let's try to download that and validate what we see. Okay, so here I am, and I'm gonna download the torrent for Ubuntu. Okay, and it lets me save the torrent. So now I'm gonna go and save this torrent into downloads in HTPC, and then torrents and CVs, and that should come up in our QbitTorrent interface once it is saved, and it reads that I added that. So let's give it a little bit of time, and here we go. It's downloading our Linux ISO, and if we check the peers, we have good connections here to a bunch of places, and everything is going through the VPN. So we do not have any problem here. We can always validate that by, for example, stopping the Gluetun container. If I stop that container, then my connection should just stop working in QbitTorrent. Let's see what happens here. So I just ordered Gluetun to stop, and let's see, it might even kill the QbitTorrent container entirely. So let's see how it behaves. Takes a little bit of time, so let's just be patient here. All right, the Gluetun is stopped. Let's go back here and see what happens. And it killed our QbitTorrent. Like I said, when we configured this, we said the container depends completely on Gluetun. If Gluetun is not running, stop running QbitTorrent. Why? It will prevent us from accidentally connecting somewhere and exposing our public IP and our actual information. But since it stops working when Gluetun stops working, that's never going to happen. This is a great way to prevent your information to be leaked outside of the VPN tunnel. So as you can see, it was connecting through the VPN, and whenever you kill that VPN, everything goes down. So that also brings into attention that you have to always pay attention. If your services are not running and you're running them behind Gluetun, then it's not going to work. Because remember also that we're exposing the web user interface through Gluetun. So that's why we don't have access to it, because Gluetun is not working, so we don't have a way to reach that web user interface. So always make sure that your Gluetun is running. That would be like the first place I would go if I know that my applications are running through it. And that's going to be it. I've shown you how to set it up, how to figure out how to configure your VPN provider, as Gluetun allows you to do that with a bunch of different providers. And I've given you examples of what happens when you provide wrong credentials, or where the Gluetun container just crashes or something like that. So I hope this was very instructive and gave you a broad perspective of how to properly use Gluetun now that we have the container manager in Synology DSM 7.2. If you liked it, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. I've noticed that a lot of people watch my videos and they find them useful, but they haven't subscribed to the channel. So I really appreciate it if you subscribe. That helps the channel grow, and that makes things easier for us to get exposed to maybe companies that want to collaborate and give us things that they want to test and review and things like that. So I really appreciate that. Remember, I'm also not monetizing this channel. I'm purposefully not monetizing. I don't want YouTube to be bombarding you with ads. So I rely entirely on your support. So you have on the link in the description below for PayPal, where you can donate, and you also have a Bitcoin address. I'll really appreciate it if you find the content useful to help me with that contributions, because that really helps me to focus on the channel. And that's gonna be it. I hope you liked it. I'll see you on the next one. And now we can use Gluetun and we can be happy.